Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. And in this episode, we're gonna be digging into a recipe that I just have no idea where it's gonna go. It is one that I picked out of the cookbook that I'm totally confused. It's called an herb pudding. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So the recipe today comes from the experienced English housekeeper. This is Elizabeth Raffold, 1769. Now, here's the recipe, and you're probably thinking pudding, right? No, here we go. Herb pudding. Of spinach, beets, parsley, and leeks, take each a handful, wash them, give them a scald in boiling water, then shred them very fine. Have ready a quart of groats steeped in warm water, about a half an hour, and a pound of hog's lard cut in little pieces. 3 large onions chopped small, 3 sage leaves hacked fine. Put in a little salt, mix all well together, and tie it up close. It will require to be taken up in the boiling to slacken the string a little. Okay, if you're like me, maybe 10 years ago, you'd read this recipe and think, what are they talking about? This is just totally, it was written in a strange way, and there's a lot of assumed things in this recipe that if you're just looking at it first blush, you don't know exactly what's going on. So let's start off with the idea of pudding. We think of pudding, we think dessert pudding, maybe dessert pudding in a cup, right? You just peel off the little foil and you just eat it right up. You don't have to do any cooking or anything. Maybe we're thinking pudding, when we think of pudding here in North America, we're thinking of a custard. That's what that stuff is. It's a custard in a cup. Puddings in the 18th century weren't that at all. They tended to be, well, what's the basis for pudding, right? The word pudding comes from the word pud. That's weird, isn't it? Which actually means gut or stomach. So these early puddings were something that you would cook in a stomach, cook in a bag. And they were, we could almost think of them like, well, you've heard of black pudding or white pudding. Those are almost like a sausage thing. So yeah, pudding has its basis in sausage. Yeah, so this pudding is a boiled pudding and it's cooked in a cloth bag. So they don't even say that there. You get the hint. They don't say boil it, but it does say tie it up close. So we're tying it in a bag. This pudding, unlike many of them, which have flour as their basis, this has oatmeal and a coarse cut oatmeal at that, groats. So it's not like flour, but it's a coarse oatmeal. And we've got herbs. Many of these puddings are sweet. This is savory. We've got herbs and we've got salt in here and we don't have any sweetness at all. So what else do we have here? We've got spinach, easy enough. Beets. Well, everything else here is a green. So I believe they mean beet greens. Parsley, leeks, those are onion-like. We have onions in here. And then we have lard. We've got a mention of lard. And it says cut small. I think the hint for us right here on lard is it's a boiled pudding and it says cut it small. Normally boiled puddings have suet in them, and suet is very hard. It's like wax. Here's a piece of suet. It's hard stuff. You can chop it up. And that's what we want in a boiled pudding. What happens is that that suet melts and it creates little pockets. It makes it much easier and sort of light and fluffy, as it were, if you could think of light and fluffy and something boiled. Anyway, that's what's happening with this suet. This lard here is not the lard you're probably thinking of. It's probably leaf lard. Leaf lard or lard, they're both rendered fats from a hog, but they come from different places and they have a very different consistency. So today we're going to be using regular beef suet because I don't have any leaf lard that would work in this context. So all we need to do now is start to shred up our greens. This recipe calls for scalding the greens first. I don't think we're actually going to need to do that. They're going to be in this boiling mass for a long period of time, so I'm not worried too much about that. A handful. We're going to half this recipe, or else we would end up with this giant boiled pudding, and we don't need one that big. So we're going to start off with some just regular spinach leaves here and chop those up nice and fine. We've got some parsley greens. We're gonna chop those up. Okay, you may not be familiar with leeks. Leeks are wonderful. Don't skip the leeks in this recipe. We're just gonna take off the big green part. We don't want that. I'm gonna get rid of that. And we're not gonna cut down here into the very, very base, but we want this section of the leek. And we probably don't need all of this. This is a nice big leek. Again, we're doing a half recipe, so we don't need 3 whole onions in here. I'm just gonna do a single onion. Sage can be a little strong, and I think that's one of the reasons why they only call for 3 leaves. And I'm just gonna cut a little bit of sage in here. And we want to use nice, since everything else is a nice fresh green, we're going to use fresh sage in here. There we are. That should be sufficient. Now we can start to assemble this. We've got all the greens in our bowl already. Let me mix them up a little bit. Actually, it calls for a little salt, doesn't it? Let's put in some salt. There we go. Now we've got our salt in here. Let me just get a good mix on it, because once I put in this oatmeal, it's going to be a mess. There we go. So I just don't understand how this is going to turn out. Okay, we've got our suet. I think I'm going to mix the suet in now. Now we do have to be careful. We want this suet to remain cold. We don't want it to melt. So we don't want that to happen. So we're going to mix our suet in, and wow, it's a lot of suet, let me tell you. We're going to stop right there. Mix that in. Suet and herbs. I don't know. It's going to be great. There we go. Now, we have our oatmeal, our groats that have been soaking, and they're just warm now. They have been soaking a half hour in warmish, almost hottish water. I don't think we want them to totally swell up, so we don't want to put them in boiling water, but hot-ish water. And there it is. Boy, that's going to be a lot. It's going to be this is a half pudding, and it's still going to be huge. So here we go. There we are. And this is what's going to hold it all together. This oatmeal is going to turn into, hopefully, a big gelatinous ball. That'll be great. So this is like a disaster waiting to happen. The more I watch this one go, I just don't know. Let's see how big. We don't want to make it huge, or it'll take too long to boil. And I don't know what it's going to turn out like anyway. Okay, let's put our pudding cloth together here. This pudding cloth was boiled, and then we put flour in it to help sort of hold everything together, although this particular fabric is pretty tightly woven, so that usually isn't too much of a problem. And we're going to bring this all up so that we don't want any gaps. And the recipe calls for taking it up and loosening it, so we know it's going to grow. So we don't want to make this really, really tight to begin with. We could make it really tight, but we don't want to do that. We're going to give it a little bit of slackness. But generally, there's enough here that, it can grow a little bit and not be a problem. I don't think I'll need to take this one up halfway around. If this was the full-size recipe and it was a big soccer ball of, of pudding, we might need to take it up, but this one, it'll be fine. You don't want your pudding cloth to burst halfway through your pudding. That is bad. But this is very strong fabric, so I'm not worried about that at all. There we go. It's ready to go in the boiling water. You don't want it to go into half boiling water. This goes into full boiling water, and this will probably boil, I'm guessing, 1 hour for this size. So let's get it into the boiling water. So are you guys ready for this masterpiece? Okay, this totally failed. This is not supposed to look like this at all. It's supposed to be in this beautiful, softball, big thing. It's supposed to look great. It's not supposed to have fallen apart. Look at this. It's terrible. It's not doing anything like what it should have done. That's what happens when you do a recipe and you haven't done it before, that exact one, and then and then it doesn't work out. Look at this. Okay, so I mean, it was supposed to peel away from this, and it's all, half of the pudding is still in the bag. And what went wrong? What went wrong? It smells good. It smells good. I went back and checked the recipe again, thought about what was going on here, and well, I guess before I want to talk about what probably failed here is, let's go ahead and try it out. Let's go ahead and find out whether it's tasty or not, right? So I'd get a little serving bowl, but I don't know what the point is. So we're just going to eat out of this big bowl, and here's a nice little serving. I mean, again, smells good. It just certainly doesn't look like it should. It's got some good flavor. The herbs came and, blended together. The leek, the onion, the other greens in there. It tastes great. Maybe you could use a little bit more salt in the mix. Other than that, I don't think I would change the taste a lot. You might consider it a little bland, so maybe we could add more greens to it to, bring in some more flavor. But other than that, I think it's pretty good. It's not, it's got suet in it, but that isn't one of the flavor notes that's way up there, so that's definitely not hurting it at all. So I'd say if it had worked out right, if it held into its pudding shape, then we would have a pretty fun dish. It'd be really neat. So why didn't it hold together? My guess is the directions, and it talked about steeping these groats. And, we went with steel cut oats here, and I think it was the right call on that for the grain. Could be that they meant something a little bit different than that. But I think what needed to happen was these oats needed to soak for longer in hotter water to bring out more of the gelatinous consistency. That's, I think, what was missing here. And so that if we would have steeped this in almost boiling water and maybe let it set an hour or two and really, got it to be a gelatinous mass, then this would have locked together exactly like it should have. But boy, it just did not happen. Maybe someday I'll have to revisit this guy or give it to Ryan to try again in one of his episodes. Maybe he can make this one work. I don't know. So I've done a lot of boiled puddings before. 10, 20, 30 boiled puddings, right? Never had one fail quite like this, but I've never made one with this kind of oat material. Oatmeal, maybe if it had more of the smaller particles of oatmeal. Maybe if we mix this a little bit with, a ground oatmeal, maybe not, 100%, but, just a little bit of that in this would help that really lock together and give us our nice, boiled pudding look, just like the Christmas boiled pudding that comes in, in a nice round bowl. That's what we want out of this one. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is it doesn't always work out. And we shouldn't be scared about, dipping in and trying these recipes. And it might take 3 and 4 tries to get this one right. The recipes are very difficult to interpret sometimes. And it could be also we need to look at some other cookbooks and see if they do something similar. And maybe they've got some extra hints that we need to figure out how to make this one work. But again, the flavors are all here. The texture maybe isn't perfect, but the flavors are all here, so we can get an idea about what's happening in 18th century cookery with a recipe just like this one. And it certainly turned out interesting. Christmas time is right around the corner, and if you'd like to see a boiled pudding that did turn out right, see this plum pudding episode.